Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today for our special briefing on the US elections. As you can see, I'm Jeremy Corbyn, and so he will replace me as the chair very shortly. Um, this call is titled Typical American Extravagance. What do the US election mean to the world? Um, and we were inspired by the quote from Julius Nyerere, who in 1969 said, "The United States is also a one state party, but with typical American extravagance, they have two of them." And it's just a week before the US elections. And that's why we're really pleased at the Peace and Justice Project to be joined by Nina Turner, Amy Goodman, and Mouin Rabanni for this important discussion, where we'll cover what the outcome of the election means for both domestic and international politics, including the current horrible situation in Palestine and the Middle East. Before I introduce our first speaker, we will be taking questions later on. So please do post any questions you might have in the comments sections, and we'll try to get to as many as possible. And also let us know where you're joining from, as many of you have done already. Finally, please do share this call on social media and do continue to support the Peace and Justice Project and our work. And again, thank you so much for joining this call, and my apologies that we started a bit late. Our first speaker, who I'm really proud to introduce, is Nina Turner. She's the founder of We Are Somebody, a capacity building organization for the working class. She was the national spokesperson in 2016 and the national co-chair in 2020 for Bernie Sanders' presidential campaigns. A former Ohio State senator, she continues to fight to advance policy that improves the material conditions of working people across the United States of America, and has also taken that message abroad, including on this call tonight. So without any further ado, I'll hand over to Nina.
Thank you. It's so great to be here with each and every one of you and to hear the views about what may happen in the United States of America just a week from now is very important, because what happens over here happens over there. It is very clear that the United States of America's conditions, positions, geopolitical strategies has an enormous impact on the rest of the world. I was just sharing with my colleagues how exhausting this particular election cycle has been for me, although I'm not on the campaign trail with either of the candidates. I was in 2016 and in 2020, but I'm not right now. But I feel even more exhausted than I did then, because we have so many contours happening in the United States of America, the othering of people, the racial animus that is stoked, that is bubbling up, which is very American, I might say, even though some people want to pretend that this is not us. No, this is us. And the candidacy of former President Donald J. Trump just brought what is at the bottom all the way up to the top, meaning that America, the United States of America, has never reckoned with its own sins when it comes to white supremacy, anti-Blackness, xenophobia, homophobia, all of those various factors that make us more vulnerable as not only a country but a world. The notion that we have not dealt with those things in this country is just making it far worse. The economy is not doing, for average people, big mamas and big papas, as I like to call them, the economy is not doing well for them. Inflation is eating what little gains that they may have made. And so people are feeling a certain kind of way in this country. And this campaign is just further bringing it out and unfortunately bringing a divide. We know that the race in this country is neck and neck. It is a 50-50 race, no exaggeration. We only know, God only knows who's going to win. I mean, it's almost like making a coin toss. And in no way, given the conditions of the former president and the things that he has been accused of, the charges against him, the court cases, him actually being a felon at this very moment, God only knows why this race is still neck and neck, but it is. On the other side of the ledger, the Democratic Party did not have a full primary, which is unfortunate. And I'm not talking about when the vice president was called upon to get into the race. I'm talking about last year. We should have had a full primary, but instead of doing that, people were forced out of the race, unfortunately. And there was only one elected official who had the intestinal fortitude to actually jump in the race, and that is a congressman from Minnesota. Congressman Dean Phillips did try to challenge, but he was pushed out. RFK Jr. pushed out. Dr. Cornel West did not necessarily ever try to run as a Democrat, but still pushed out, where you have the Democratic Party suing in certain states to kick people off the ballot. And then bringing up the Green Party, the two political parties will double team, will come together just to double team any third party candidate. So we just have a maelstrom of things happening in this country that really makes this moment in our country's history just really, it just upends almost everything. And I do believe that no matter what happens on November the 5th, we might not even know who won before that Saturday. Some people are predicting people are going to be up in arms either way. And so how do we as a nation begin to really, really heal the fissures that are pulling us apart? It is bigger than Trump. It is bigger than this election cycle. It is something that we have to deal with as a nation. And so I don't know. I don't know what will happen. If I had a crystal ball and could predict it, I would, but it really is too close to call.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Nina. That was a really helpful introduction. And just to note, Nina may have to leave a bit earlier. I know she's going to try and stay as long as possible. But I'd really be interested just to ask you, if I could, on Kamala Harris, because I think there's a lot of talk about Trump and what disaster Trump would be for the globe and the presidency. But in your opinion, how much would Harris break from the Biden administration, not only on foreign policy, but also on domestic policy?
Excellent question. I'm not sure how much. I mean, countless times the vice president has been asked what would she do differently, and she has said, "I wouldn't do much different. I wouldn't be much different." And then at other times, she will say, "Well, I'm a new generation of leadership," not really given any particulars. I will say, when it comes to what is happening in Gaza, and also now the more expanded potential for war. That's things that are happening in Lebanon and other places in the Middle East. She certainly has not shown the courage that is necessary to separate herself from the Biden administration. But it's hard, I want our viewers to understand that she is the current vice president. And so trying to politically separate herself from the administration that she is part of is like walking a tightrope. But recently, I would say within the last 2 weeks, President Biden has given the vice president the leeway to separate herself from him. And she has not done that as expansively as one would want her to do, in terms of really trying to win over those voters that are still unsure about who they're going to vote for. Poll after poll shows that the majority of Democratic voters want to see a ceasefire. They want to see an arms embargo, but still, my party is not listening to their voters, and younger voters especially want to see this happen. And then when you look at polling of all types of voters, the majority of the American people do not want to see what is happening in the Middle East continue. But neither candidate is addressing this. So I'm not sure. I mean, in terms of the how Trump comports himself, certainly that is a big difference between her and him. But policy wise, and how her candidacy or her service as the next president of the United States of America would change material conditions, we have yet to really hear in a deep way how that would happen. Now, leave no doubt, there is a difference between neo-fascist and a neoliberal. I often say neo-fascism kills you quick and neoliberalism kills you slow. So it's the difference between having 24 hours to live or somebody saying, "I'm about to slit your throat right now." I mean, a lot of people will give me the 24 hours because I might be able to turn things around. And that is really how people are feeling as I travel the country and talk to folks. That is how a lot of folks who are not in the bubble, who are not part of the faithful, who are not a part of this is my party and I'm going to go along to get along. I'm talking about the average everyday American is struggling so hard with this election cycle. And Gaza and the economy, immigration, all of those things play a very important and significant role on how people are feeling in this country about the 2024 presidential election.
Great. That was really comprehensive. Thank you so much, Nina. And do check out Nina's organization, We Are Somebody. I will post a link in the comments so that you can do so. But thank you very much, Nina, for that. Our next guest, who I will introduce now, is Amy Goodman. As many of you may know, Amy Goodman is a journalist, columnist, investigative reporter, author, and the host of the critically acclaimed Democracy Now! Show. She's interviewed several prominent public figures, including Edward Snowden, Noam Chomsky, Bill Clinton, and Greta Thunberg. And her investigative journalism career includes coverage of the East Timor independence movement, Morocco's occupation of Western Sahara, and Chevron's role in Nigeria. And she has been awarded numerous accolades, including the George Polk Award, which some have described as one of the only of a couple of journalism prizes that means anything. So thank you very much for joining us, Amy, and over to you.
Well, it's great to be with you. And I'm here in New York City, close to our studios at democracynow.org, but also just around the corner from Madison Square Garden, where on Sunday, 20,000 people gathered to celebrate Donald Trump. It was what did the Times describe it as? Something like a carnival of hate and xenophobia. It was, to say the least, as we move into Halloween in the United States, terrifying. You had it opened with a so-called comedian talking about an island of garbage. We'll call it Puerto Rico. But it wasn't just him. And even today, after the uproar that has taken place around what he said, Donald Trump has not actually distanced himself in any meaningful way, but it wouldn't even matter if that so-called comic was there. One of his top aides is Stephen Miller, who spoke about America just being for Americans. President Trump himself talked about beginning his next presidency with a mass deportation of millions, beginning in places like Springfield, Ohio, not far from where Nina Turner is right now, where he and his running mate, who also spoke on Sunday, J.D. Vance, talked about the Haitian population eating cats and dogs. While that spread hilarious memes all over the world of ridicule, in fact, Donald Trump is a very street smart politician. He understands what it means to primally affect people and to otherize and marginalize people. So you talk about people's families, their pets, and they get scared when they don't know. They don't listen to anybody else. So they went after immigrants, they went after African Americans. And of course, the level of misogyny, President Trump, Nina Turner mentioned that here you have a guy, he went on trial and was convicted in a civil trial of sexual assault. The judge said, in common parlance, President Trump was convicted of rape. You have him facing a series of other trials. He will go to trial unless he becomes president, where he will try to dismiss at least the federal cases. The state cases he can't. And right after the election, he is expected to be sentenced for one of the trials that he was found guilty of in dozens of corruption, found guilty of dozens of corruption charges. So that's President Trump. He will speak tonight in the heart of Pennsylvania's Puerto Rican community. And again, as I said, it's not just the Puerto Rican community, it's the Latinx community in the United States, absolutely up in arms about what he had to say. Puerto Ricans who voted for him are demanding they get their ballots back. But in a place like Pennsylvania, there are close to 500,000 Puerto Ricans who live there. In a place like Michigan, Wisconsin, 61,000 in Michigan. These are the battleground states. In New Jersey alone, something like 400,000 Puerto Ricans. So it'll be very interesting to see what he has to say. That's Donald Trump. Kamala Harris will speak on the ellipse tonight. They talk about her presenting her closing argument. The ellipse is where President Trump spoke on January 6, 2021. So she will take on the insurrection that he encouraged, that he fomented. So sad that it was hundreds of people who have gone to jail for him. And though he told them he would be right there with them, in fact, he never went, followed them into Congress where they went, where they injured more than 100 police officers. It's an astounding story, at the time roundly condemned by Republicans, Democrats, and people of every stripe alike because of the level of violence on that day to try to stop President Biden from taking office. But the fact of the matter is, those people, those Republicans who condemned Donald Trump roundly for what he did in the last final weeks in office, have actually surrounded him, have protected him now, and afraid that if he becomes president again, they will be marginalized. And so they protect him and wrap themselves around him. But his inner circle has left him. Those that worked most closely with him, people like General John Kelly, who was his longest standing chief of staff, said he is the definition of a fascist. The chair of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, General Milley, also called him a fascist. You know, Donald Trump, who asked his generals if when the Black Lives Matter folks were marching in the streets, if soldiers could shoot them in the legs. And now he's calling for going after the enemy from within, or the enemy within, a Nazi term, going after, as he calls it, the left lunatics in this country, who he wants to imprison, who he wants, if he's not deporting other people. So that carnival of fascism actually repeats something that happened at Madison Square Garden in 1939, when the same number of people, 20,000 people, had an actual Nazi rally to support the Nazi Party in Germany. Kamala Harris, we don't know what she's going to say tonight, taking on the economy, taking on the insurrection. I mean, you've got what I think is a sleeping giant that we may not realize its power until Election Day. And I'm curious if Nina Turner thinks the same way about the whole issue of reproductive rights and abortion. There are, in something like 11 or 12 of the 50 states, there are abortion referenda on the ballot. Now, 10, 20 years ago, conservatives would put anti-LGBTQ marriage equality, anti-gay marriage measures on the ballot to get people to vote. And then they would be there at the polls, so they would vote for the conservative candidate. But in this country, that attitude is turned around. The majority of people support marriage equality. And so that wouldn't get even conservatives out to the polls. And now the issue is abortion. And across the political spectrum, men and women support abortion rights, reproductive rights in this country. And even in the reddest, most pro-Trump states, when there is an abortion ballot up for a vote, it wins overwhelmingly. And if people come out just to vote for that, maybe not satisfied with either candidate, Harris or Trump, they will probably vote for the candidates that are on the ballot as well, for their choice of candidates. But that issue of abortion, the overturning of Roe v. Wade in the United States that happened in 2022, could be a major determining factor in who becomes president. When it comes to foreign policy, well, I'm really looking forward to hearing Mouin Rabanni. We are in a horrifying time with the situation in Gaza, with Israel, as we speak, devastating, destroying northern Gaza, not to mention the rest of Gaza. Bombing Lebanon, it bombed Syria. Israel bombed Iran, bombed Yemen. And I think Netanyahu is very well aware of the US election. It's amazing the number of, forget international law for a minute, the number of national laws that are violated by our own administration in Washington, the Biden, sadly, Harris administration in Washington. Just looking at the Leahy law, named for the former Vermont senator, Senator Leahy, which said that if a country violates human rights, they don't get weapons. I used to cover Indonesia's occupation of East Timor, one of the great genocides of the 20th century, and the violation of the Leahy law if the US sold weapons to Indonesia when they were killing the population of East Timor. And only recently, because of tremendous popular outcry, has the administration spoken up, because probably they're in election period, essentially saying, if Israel continues to starve Gaza, prevent humanitarian aid from getting in, they will give them 30 days to turn that practice around. I just interviewed a State Department official who quit over the US policy towards Israel, continuing to arm Israel as it engages in this slaughter. And he said, where is it written in the Leahy law that you will wait 30 days? And of course, that 30 days takes you after the election. And this election is key. It is true. Could be one of the most important elections in US history. It is a referendum on what the United States, not only the role of the United States in our own country, but in the rest of the world. Years ago, I interviewed a woman from Guyana about what was happening there. And then in our music break, we were ushering her out to talk about the US elections, and she wouldn't get up. And I said, what's the matter? And she said, I want to be part of your discussion on the US elections. I said, but you're from Guyana. Why do you want to talk about it? She said, because I believe, she said, everyone in the world should get to vote for president of the United States. And she was making a very profound point that what the US does as the most powerful country on earth matters everywhere. And that's why people in the United States also have a very special responsibility and obligation. And I think that the silver lining of this election is seeing the number of people, the millions of people in this country who deeply care about what's happening in the Middle East. Yes, Muslims and Arab Americans, but together with progressive Jews who have come out in astounding numbers, being arrested around the country, groups like Jewish Voice for Peace saying, no, not in my name. Young people across this country. I remember when 1,000 Black pastors wrote a letter to President Biden saying, we have never seen anything like this since the civil rights movement. They didn't even expect this, they said, that their congregations are more galvanized around Palestine than on any single issue outside of the civil rights movement of the 1960s. There is a complete change in this country, even at the highest levels. And that is really the hope, what has changed in the United States. But that change is not fast enough for the people of Palestine, for the occupied people of the West Bank and Gaza, who are losing their lives in the tens of thousands. Or Ralph Nader says he believes that the underestimate is so enormous that you could be talking up to hundreds of thousands of people who have died there. That's just a little snippet what is happening. Next week, we're headed off to, after the election, Baku, Azerbaijan, for the UN Climate Summit. The issue of climate also galvanizes especially young people in this country, as our country is whipped from coast to coast by climate catastrophe. And the issue of equality, always. Nina Turner just talked about the cost of living in this country, that bigger idea of who gains and who doesn't. President Trump is very clear, as in speech after speech, he is joined by the richest man in the world, the billionaire Elon Musk, who is now being sued by the Philadelphia DA because he says he will give $1 million a day to voters in Pennsylvania and other battleground states if they sign up on their petitions. And they're saying this is election manipulation and it's illegal. But just a snippet of where we stand a few days before the election.
So
I don't hear you, Jeremy, if you're.
can you hear me now?
Oh, yes, we hear you.
Right. Okay, sorry. I think we double muted ourselves at two ends because I'm not in the same room as Artin just now. Amy, thanks ever so much for that. And great to see you looking so good. And thanks for that analysis about the start into the election campaign. Well, the discussion we're having about the election now. So what I'm going to do, keep you there, and then I'm going to call Mouin Rabanni to speak next, a Dutch Palestinian Middle East analyst who's written for The Nation, The Guardian, Al Jazeera, and co-editor of Jadaliyya, and special advisor to the International Crisis Group. And so since the issues of Palestine, Gaza are so dominant in everything we're doing, then we're looking forward to your analysis. Just to say, today in the British Parliament, the British government, yes, it did condemn Israel for making illegal any support for UNRWA in any way. And in its legislation, it effectively annexed the Gaza and the West Bank and said that they have control over that so far as control of UNRWA is concerned. We demanded condemnation and so on to the British government, and they did all of that. And then the one question they wouldn't answer was, will you cease supplying the weapons to Israel, which are causing the mayhem and the catastrophic loss of over 40,000 lives already? An answer there was none. So easy time. Over to you, Mouin.
Thank you very much. And I'm grateful to the Peace and Justice Project for inviting me to participate, particularly alongside Nina Turner and Amy Goodman. I've been asked to speak about the upcoming US elections and their implications for Palestine and the Middle East. The short answer is that the result is unlikely to make a significant difference. Israeli impunity has become a central principle of US foreign policy, less a means to an end than an end in itself. While neither Kamala Harris nor Donald Trump share Joe Biden's fanatic devotion to Israel, both are likely to revert to the traditional US policy of unconditional support for the supremacist apartheid state. This may make a difference at the margins, but that's about it. While it's true that Israel's Netanyahu has a clear preference for Trump, Agent Orange is also viewed as erratic and ultimately unreliable by Israel, just as he is by the rest of his acolytes. In the atmosphere of hysteria that currently dominates Israel, Harris, by contrast, is seen as an enemy. This means that the period between now and January of 2025, when Biden is finally wheeled out of the White House, is the period of maximum danger, most obviously for the Palestinians in the Gaza Strip, but also for those in the West Bank, for Lebanon, and for the risks of a war against Iran and potentially Syria. This is because Israel believes that what is possible between now and January of next year may no longer be possible after that date. Looking more broadly at the region, there is also little reason to expect significant change whether Harris or Trump win. Biden's Middle East policies were, for all intents and purposes, those of a second Trump administration. He changed literally nothing, whether with respect to Palestine, the occupied Syrian Golan Heights, the Western Sahara, the Iran nuclear agreement, Yemen, or the promotion of dictatorship and autocracy throughout the region. I'd also like to make a few comments about the election itself. To the best of my understanding, no candidate has a divine right to anyone's vote. Trump appears to have addressed this problem by insisting that he will win, and should he lose, by insisting that he won. The Harris campaign's approach, not unlike that of Keir Starmer in your country, has been to vilify and demonize a key constituency for making the simple point that she has to earn their vote by, for example, renouncing support for genocide, by refusing to arm it, or at least distancing herself from it. I suspect the Harris campaign is the first example in modern political history where a candidate is demanding the votes of those she systematically refuses to meet with or be seen in public with as an inalienable right. She and her minions will, of course, blame the anti-genocide constituency rather than her steadfast support for Israel's crimes and atrocities in the event that she loses the election. Tragically, the Democrats are prepared to inflict another 4 years of Donald Trump upon themselves and upon the world at large for the sake of Israeli genocide and impunity. It is this arrogance, this sense of entitlement, that is leading growing numbers of voters who, under different circumstances, would be counted among Harris's natural constituents to conclude that the Democrats will only learn their lesson if one is administered to them at the ballot box. They will have no one but themselves to blame. Finally, we should not exaggerate the importance of elections. They are, of course, not insignificant, nor, for that matter, is the arena of parliamentary politics insignificant. But momentous political developments emerge from sustained political struggles throughout society rather than the ballot box alone. To give but two examples from US history, the US withdrawal from Vietnam was not decided by an election and was in fact conducted by the Nixon administration after Tricky Dick won re-election by a landslide. Similarly, the US withdrawal from Iraq was largely arranged by George W. Bush, not Obama. And this is because the people of Vietnam, the people of Iraq, and the people of the United States left them with no other choice. Thank you very much.
And that's a very good analysis. And I must say, I do remember Nixon winning by a landslide over George McGovern, who had opposed the Vietnam War. And then Nixon was forced to resign a couple of years later after Watergate. And even though much of that was known about during the campaign itself. I'd now like to call Nina Turner. Nina, are you there?
She's already spoken.
Oh, has she? Oh, right. Who's coming up next then?
I was the last one.
Yeah, okay, sorry. I think you should take over chairing this, actually. Are you okay for that? We had some votes in Parliament, which made me later than I expected, so I was rushing here. And anyway, so Artin started it off. And so I've got some questions here, I think. Yes. Question. How to tackle capitalism when people such as J.D. Vance turn to it for solutions to break cycles of deprivation they experience growing up in poverty? I think that's actually a profound question, because the language used by Vance and Trump particularly is one of populism towards poorer people, saying that I'll solve your problems because I'm not one of these wealthy capitalists actually destroying things, whereas in reality they're doing exactly that. Anybody got any views on that?
I mean, they're faux populists.
That's a great way of putting it. Yeah, explain, because you've got a largely British audience here that I'm sure do understand all this, but maybe you can explain from
Yeah,
your
I mean
point of view?
they're putting on airs, as we might say in some of the African American communities vernacular. They're playing in our face, meaning they present themselves as champions of the everyday working person in this country, but in actuality, they are not. And crony capitalism is the problem in the United States of America. In this country, corporations and people with the most connections have the greatest influence, sad to say, but it is true, on the outcome of these elections. I mean, former President Donald J. Trump is being fueled by multimillionaires and billionaires. Now, conversely, I wish I could say that my party, the Democratic Party, was not, but they actually are being fueled by really that same energy and that same force that wants to be able to have an outsized influence on the outcome of elections. And not just the outcomes, even before we get to the outcomes, they have outsized influence on who gets a chance to actually run. Vice President Harris, in the short time that she's been in this race, has already raised, I mean, the race has been going on for about 70 days. Amy, jump in and correct me if I'm wrong, a little over that. But she's raised over $1 billion already. That should tell you something. So we're dealing with, in the United States of America, a corrupt duopoly. That those at the very top, and I'm not talking about the faithful, because you do have some faithful, even in the Republican Party, they're all not MAGA-like. And you have faithful in the Democratic Party, meaning they really believe in the power of their respective parties. The challenge is that the ultra wealthy of our country, and even the world, I know you're going through the same thing in the UK, can and do oftentimes control the outcomes, and they also control who gets a chance to compete. And so when you have a Senator J.D. Vance or President Trump putting out that faux populism when people are suffering economically, as we know, nature abhors a vacuum. So their phoniness towards this attracts people because they are in pain. President Donald J. Trump is saying he's going to do something different than what the Harris-Biden administration did. Well, he had the opportunity to drain the swamp, as he once said. He had that opportunity when he was president. And not only did he not drain the swamp, he brought more swamp creatures to the swamp. So we have a problem in the United States of America. Citizens United really cemented the fact that money is speech in this country. And we are going to have to get a president and a Congress that is willing to overturn, through the powers that they have through legislation, the legislative branch, the Congress, Citizens United. It's been a disaster for the United States of America. The corruption is because of money in politics has a corrupting force, especially when it comes from a very few. And my last point, I wish, like NASCAR drivers, and I hope viewers in the UK know a little bit about NASCAR, where the drivers on their suits, they have who sponsored them. They have all these patches. I want to see American elected officials wear the patches of who purchased them, because most of them answer to their owner donors, and they do not answer to the everyday needs of working class people across the spectrum, be they independent, Green Party, Republican, Democrat, or no party. They do not ultimately answer to the average everyday person in this country, and that is a problem. So Donald J. Trump is a type of threat to democracy, but he certainly is not the only threat to democracy.
Very interesting parallel to what's happened here in the general election we just had in July. The Labour vote was lower than it was in 2019. The Conservative vote was way down. The right-wing Reform Party vote went up, but also went up was the Green vote and the Independents. And so we now have, yes, a very large but quite electorally unstable Labour majority in Parliament. But we also have now a significant variety of parties, including our own independent group in Parliament. And the duopoly of politics is beginning to end in lots of ways, despite huge amounts of money being put into both the major parties by private interests. I've got a question which I'm going to put to all of you, because I think it will help us historically to understand a lot in the United States. The question is, the United States is currently split along firmly entrenched historical lines. What would it take to unite the people and their states? And as I understand that question, that is partly geographical, but also I suspect community and class based. So any views on that question? Who's going to go first? Amy, any view on it?
The question is, the U.S. is currently split along firmly entrenched historical lines. What will it take to unite the people and their states? I mean, I also wonder if people really understand. It's hard for Americans to understand our system, you know, that the president isn't directly elected, that we have this electoral college. And so while we have 50 states, we're only focused on a few states like Michigan, like Pennsylvania, like Arizona. And what's interesting about that also is a number of these states are the least populous states, but that's where all the effort and attention goes. I just had a side question for Nina as she spoke, because, you know, she is from Ohio, from J.D. Vance's state. We have this unusual situation where the millionaire candidates, they say they are more independent because they don't have to turn to others for money. Donald Trump is not like this because he turns to the billionaires to support him. But J.D. Vance, essentially, though he wrote Hillbilly Elegy, and I'm curious what Nina Turner says, how he grew up in Ohio and then goes attacking, you know, Springfield, Ohio, for the migrant, the immigrant community there that's there legally. When he began to be cultivated to run for office, you know, he's basically supported by this one billionaire, this Trump ally who spoke at past Trump conventions, and that was Peter Thiel. But how J.D. Vance, this, you know, the vice presidential candidate who could well be the next future Republican presidential candidate, was created.
Yeah, I mean, he's really lost his way, and the people in the UK, Ohio is a Midwestern state. Very much, you know, steel was our major industry once upon a time. Really blue collar. Some of the, not some, but some of the Clinton policies, Amy, as we know, really destroyed that pocket of the working class with NAFTA and CAFTA. The JD Vance, Senator JD Vance, has really pretty much lost his way. And so although he wrote Hillbilly Effigy and really tried to center poor rural whites, in a way, he has lost his connection, and he is attractive to the billionaire class because they know that he will absolutely do their bidding. And that's not to say that all ultra wealthy people will do that. I mean, we did have a president in these United States of America, Franklin D. Roosevelt. And he was of wealth and means, and his wife, Eleanor Roosevelt, who played an extraordinary role in his presidency. While they were of wealth, they definitely had a keen eye towards the suffering of working class people, so much so that FDR put forward an economic, you know, a second Bill of Rights, if you will, to complement our original Bill of Rights, saying that the original Bill of Rights in the United States of America was not enough, that we needed an economic Bill of Rights, one that made sure that people were educated, that people had health care. And this was in the 20th century. And so we've been fighting the same battles in the 21st century with the resurgence of what I call the 21st century progressive movement that Senator Bernard Sanders ignited when he started running in 2016. But Amy, Senator J.D. Vance, from what I can tell right now, is a snake. He's a snake oil salesman, and he is so far from what he wrote in that book. It is baffling that he is puzzling, I should say, that he is. And the reason why he is being backed by the billionaire class is because they see in him somebody that will do their bidding, pure and simple.
Thanks. Mouin, any views on that?
Well, I'm neither American nor do I live in the U.S., so I'll leave it to Nina
neither
and
am I.
Amy to analyze the ways of U.S. plutocracy for us. I defer to their views.
You know, one other thing just to add, and maybe Mouin could weigh in on this, is that we're talking about individual billionaires, but there is the billionaire class of corporations, and that weighs in very heavily when it comes to the Middle East. I mean, those that are experience the greatest bonanza, it's hard to put that word together when you're talking about what's happening in Palestine, are the weapons manufacturers. And, you know, so many of the weapons that are being sent to Israel by the United States, they must be bought, and they are paid for with US taxpayer dollars from US weapons manufacturers.
Yeah, just a question for both of you, well, all three of you actually. We talked a bit about Gaza, Palestine, and so on. The issues, as I see it, are yes, the war's going on in Gaza and Palestine, but also Ukraine, Russia, Sudan, and other places. And what we've done in the Peace and Justice Project is produced this book called The Monstrous Anger of the Guns, the wording of which comes from the Wilfred Owen poem of the First World War, when he said, what is it that men who are herded like cattle towards the guns hear last? And it is the monstrous anger of the guns. And it is about the malign influence of the arms industry in dominating politics in both sides of the Atlantic. And so I guess all of us on this call want to see peace and the justice that must come with that peace in both Palestine and in Ukraine, Russia. Do you see any possibility of either Trump or Harris seriously trying to bring about a ceasefire in either or both of those conflicts?
Who's that question to?
Yeah, to anybody. You can take it.
Well, I don't think that either Trump or Harris will promote a ceasefire unless they feel that it's in their interest to do so, unless they feel that the cost of not having a ceasefire outweighs the benefits of actually pursuing one. And that could come about in various ways, or a combination of ways. It relates to the actual situation in the Middle East. Are the losses to U.S. interests mounting? It has to do with domestic opposition. If, for example, Harris would win by a razor-thin majority, and it becomes clear that the anti-genocide vote is the reason that she had to sweat it out until the last moment, that may motivate her to take this into consideration as she puts together her foreign policy. I think another key element that's missing here is that the Arab states have reduced themselves to impotent and passive spectators and have not made any measures of opposition to U.S. policy. So from Washington's perspective, why change anything? Because it's not affecting their interests in the region. A very different situation, for example, from October 1973, when Washington's most loyal Arab allies instituted an oil boycott against the United States. So I think there's a whole combination of factors, what's happening in the region versus what's happening domestically, because absent such changes, exactly as you've said, it will be the weapons manufacturers, it will be the lobbies, it will be the billionaires, and so on, that won't have any counterforce to their preferred method of operation.
Amy or Nina, do you have any hopes that either candidate will do anything to try to realistically bring about a ceasefire in either the Middle East or in Ukraine?
I mean, hope does spring eternal. I can't wait to hear what Amy has to say about it. But as I can see now, I was talking to my colleagues before we came live. We were just really having this conversation about there really is no daylight between the Biden-Harris administration and Trump on issues that are happening in the Middle East. And this is really sad. It is sad for our country because the overwhelming majority of Americans want to see a ceasefire. They want to see embargo. They want to see our country adhere to our own laws. As Amy had mentioned earlier in her remarks, the Leahy Law, the Foreign Assistance Act, even well before we get to international law. But neither one of these candidates, even right now to this moment, has shown any clear clarity in wanting to stop the death and destruction and call Israel to account for what it has done. And there is a ripple effect, because what happens over there happens over here, that none of us can escape this. And for me, as a politician, I see very clearly the same energy that would allow for 40,000 Palestinians to be killed, millions to live and try to navigate in famine, is the same energy that does not care if the children in Cleveland or Chicago or their parents or grandparents have health care, or whether people are making a living wage in this country. It is the same energy. And so that breaks my heart more than anything about this election cycle, because there are very much similarities in terms of energy and policy and who is held in high esteem in terms of individuals' worthiness. It is a similar energy domestically that I see happening internationally. And so I really don't hold out hope for politicians that will allow Americans to languish in poverty, as even though we are a hegemon nation. I'm not surprised that they really don't care about what is happening to the men, women, and children in Gaza, and even an expansion all the way in a Middle East, not only a Middle East war, but possibly WW3. And that should concern all of us, no matter where we live in the world, because we cannot escape this.
And let's not forget what keeps the prime minister of Israel out of prison, perhaps, and what keeps the former president of the United States out of prison, is both of them getting the presidency and keeping the prime ministership. So they have a vested interest, Netanyahu does, in keeping these wars going, that keeps him in power. But I also want to say, I have thought for a while now that the reason Kamala Harris is the presidential nominee is because of the pro-Palestinian, the Palestinian justice movement in this country. And that is because everywhere President Biden went, I know they say it's the debate he had with Trump and he was quite diminished and he was forced to step down. And it is true, he's diminished. But he was getting diminished before that, not just physically, but everywhere he went as the presidential candidate. I mean, he would go to have bestowed on him the endorsement of the UAW. That's United Auto Workers, a very important union, and that's really an important endorsement. He goes to the endorsement event, and all the UAW workers are holding up signs that say ceasefire now, because they had from the beginning endorsed a ceasefire. And everywhere he went, his events had to get smaller and smaller because they had to vet who was coming to those events, because they were constantly being interrupted, which I think really made him skip a beat. Even this past Monday, he went to Arizona as the first US president in history to issue an apology for the Native American residential schools that were designed to rip children away from their Native American families, to exterminate their own culture and go to these residential schools. In the midst of this, when Native Americans, to say the least, were very appreciative of this apology, a young indigenous activist stood up and said, "You're talking about a genocide of the past. What about the ongoing genocide now in Palestine?" So many millions of people are engaged in this issue across the country that I think ultimately Biden couldn't take the heat. It really discombobulated him and ultimately led to Kamala Harris being chosen. Then
Does this mean Kamala Harris could lose Michigan?
I mean, it is conceivable what will happen. But then she had to choose her vice presidential candidate. And the person that was favored, Josh Shapiro, the very popular governor of Pennsylvania, had viciously excoriated the University of Pennsylvania students who had set up encampments, compared them to the KKK, the Ku Klux Klan, the white supremacist organization. And ultimately, Harris knew she could not move forward with someone like him at her side. So she chose the most progressive of the people who are being put forward. So I would say that the pro-justice movement were the ones responsible for them. Now you might say, well, so are they going to endorse a ceasefire? I see President Trump quite literally represents a wall, and he proudly does, whether it's a wall on the southern border or every which way. Kamala Harris, I think, represents a door. Now, granted, the door is slammed shut. It might even be locked from the inside. But these grassroots movements in this country, as you have them in Britain, and they are rising up all over, these grassroots movements have the capacity to burst open that door, to break it open. And I think that is the hope.
I've got two questions that have come in. I think you might have seen them, but if not, I'll just read them. The one I'd like your comments on, all three, is what shape are the socialist stroke left in currently, and what can be done to strengthen them? Because I'm involved with various left movements across Europe and building the left in this country, both inside and outside the Labour Party. I'd be interested to know how effective left and particularly pro-Palestinian forces are in the US.
I would say the activist portion of the left movement is strong and steady. The uncommitted movement, to the points that Amy made, definitely has been shaking the foundation, the encampments by the students. The students really are leading the way, just as they have been involved in most movements in this country, particularly the civil rights movement comes to mind, with the freedom riders riding through the South, or the college students that sat at lunch counters to desegregate those lunch counters and force businesses, and by extension force this government to do something about treating African Americans as less than second-class citizens. So the activist movement is very clear. I would say the elected leaders within the movement are not so much. We have a congressional progressive caucus that might as well be neoliberal light. They don't stand up. They don't use their power. They don't make a demand. They don't cause neoliberals to shake in their boots at all. And then portions of the squad, certainly not all the squad members, but the political class has definitely steamrolled the Congressional Progressive Caucus and portions of the squad. And just for the UK viewers, the squad consists of the most progressive elected officials in the United States Congress. So when people think about Congresswoman Cori Bush, who was defeated by AIPAC money, Congressman Bowman, who also was defeated by AIPAC money deliberately. Both of these candidates are African Americans, but I will put that in the parking lot about the anti-Blackness of AIPAC. But people may be familiar with Congresswoman Ocasio-Cortez, Congresswoman Rashida Tlaib, and Congresswoman Rashida Tlaib has been holding up the mantle almost by herself. It has been purely her and Congresswoman Cori Bush who have been really showing the type of courage and leadership that is necessary to try to turn the tide from the inside. But nobody is really coming to save the progressive movement here. I don't necessarily think it's going to come from anybody that is actively elected right now. It is very much going to come from the outside forces pushing. And I love the analogy that Amy gave about the difference between a wall and a door that's locked from the inside. I think that really is the hope of most people. Again, the difference between neo-fascism and neoliberalism is the time and effort it would take to maybe turn the tide on neoliberalism if we can. And neo-fascism just knocks you out quick.
Mouin, do you think the anti-war movements across Europe and North America in support of the Palestinian people have had much effect on the policies being pursued by Israel?
Not immediately, but I would add that we would be wrong to look for an immediate impact. These things are cumulative and they build over time. And I would say that never did I expect in my lifetime to see the groundswell and the scale of activism and support and solidarity with the Palestinians that we've seen during the past year, whether in the United States or in Europe. A decade ago, if you would have predicted this, you would have been mocked, and no one would ever have expected this. And I think it's important to recognize that what we've witnessed during the past year is the result of the cumulative effort and labors of many, many people, including, of course, yourselves, over many years. And they're already beginning to have an impact. I mean, your election, the election of independence in the British elections this year. And in the US, of course, it's a different story where several candidates were defeated in the primaries. But I think, I gave earlier the examples of the example of the Vietnam War. That war didn't end when you had hundreds of thousands of people in the street. It took, unfortunately, several years for that to bear fruit. I think, in a sense, this is probably going to be quicker because here we also have, for the very first time, major fissures in one of the two main political parties. I mean, who would have ever thought that the Democratic Party would be split on the issue of Palestine? Well, today it is. And so that, I think, offers real hope. So do I think that all this activism is going to produce a ceasefire in 2024? Unfortunately not. But as we look down the line, I think it's entirely reasonable to expect that it will have a real political impact and has a very realistic prospect of producing significant policy changes.
And Jeremy, I want to add to what Moen just said there. The split, if you will, is between the grass tops of the Democratic Party and the grassroots, meaning that the majority of Democratic voters who have been polled in this country want to see a ceasefire, want to see an embargo, want to see all of this go away. The split is with the power brokers who don't have the intestinal fortitude to answer to the calls and the cries of the people. So his analysis is definitely spot on. And you have some Republicans, I'm talking about everyday citizens, not those with the fancy titles, who want to see this come to an end. And the courage of college students, the point that Amy brought up about Governor Josh Shapiro comparing those college students that had the encampments, just standing up for peace, pro-Palestinian lives, just peace, being called members of the KKK, minimizing, because what that governor did was minimize the pain of my people who were chattel slaves in this country. And even after chattel slavery was abolished in the United States of America, had to live in terror generation after generation at the hands of the KKK. And so for him to call pro-peace college students similar to KKK is definitely a disregard, a disservice, and a disrespect to African-American people in this country. That the groundswell that is happening, though, is something that is nothing short of spectacular, and it is going to be cumulative. You have Jewish Voices of Peace, which I know, I think Amy had mentioned them as well, but you do have people from all walks of life, all backgrounds in this country and around the world who have the courage to stand up and speak a certain type of truth to power, but it is whether or not that power can be pushed so far that they will, in fact, take action. That is really what we need to have happen.
We had levels of abuse hurled at the peace marches in London by the Home Secretary, who called them marches of hate, which was outrageous in every way. The marches have been huge, which is a credit to the Palestine Solidarity Campaign and Stop the War Coalition and CND and many others, not just over the past year, but over years. And all of our marches have a very large and very significant Jewish block of marchers on them. And we have had Stephen Capo, who's a Holocaust survivor, speaking at our rallies, and many other people. And so the idea that ours are sort of religiously sectarian marches of hate is just appalling and nonsense and wrong. And we've got another national march this Saturday in London when we're going down to visit the US Embassy to have some words down there. And it's going to be huge, as indeed all of our marches have been huge. And we'll carry on doing it and carry on making demands in Parliament, because that is the only thing that we can be doing. Listen,
You know,
before we finish, bring your.
Jeremy, I just wanted to
Oh, go
say
on, Amy, please do. Yeah.
you mentioned the Holocaust survivor. I think that is a big untold story. The number of, I mean, in the United States, Holocaust survivors, descendants of Holocaust survivors, in Israel, the hostage families, the number of people we have spoken to. I think of someone like Maoz Inan, who lost his mother and father, 85 and 87 years old, in a kibbutz on October 7th, and how from that day he has demanded a ceasefire, traveled the world with a Palestinian colleague whose older brother died after being tortured in Israeli jail. The kind of alliances, the kind of voices that the corporate media may not bring us, and that's another issue, is how important it is to have independent media bringing out the voices of the grassroots. Because I really do believe that those who care about war and peace, those who care about climate catastrophe, those who care about inequality and racial and economic justice are not a fringe minority, not even a silent majority, but the silenced majority, silenced by the corporate media, which is why it's absolutely critical to take the media back.
I listen, we're going to have to finish in a moment because we've got that beautiful child joining us with Nina. What's her name?
Say hi, Jada. Jada.
Jada. And it's 1 o'clock in the morning where Moam is. So he needs to go and get some rest. I think the takeaway from this discussion is really the last thing you just said, Amy, about the media. You do a fantastic job with your channel and your news system, and you do give that constant space and place and voice where you don't have the hectoring aggressive interviews. You let those of us that you kindly invite onto your programs discuss in a rational way and talk about things. We need to build up an alternative media globally. We cannot allow our system of communication to be completely controlled by a few billionaires who happen to own whatever the system is. So we've got to change that. Listen, last words. Any predictions on the election outcome?
God only knows. I mean,
Nope.
God only knows at this point.
I can only tell you, you have to turn into democracynow.org to find out the results.
And do you think social movements can change elections or change the electoral system?
I think social movements can change the world.
Yeah, the civil rights movement is one of the best examples of that. But as our colleague said, it's cumulative and it is over time. But politicians are going to have to be forced to do the right thing. Most of the time, inherently, they don't necessarily do it without that push.
Yes, I listen to the cynical talk in the comfort of the tea rooms around Parliament, and but it's up to us to unite together on this. And
Jeremy, I want to let especially your audience know, and the global audience, on election night, November 5th, between 8 and midnight Eastern time, Democracy Now! Will be broadcasting what's happening. I can't say we'll be broadcasting the results because, as Nina pointed out at the beginning, who knows when those final results will come in and then be accepted. And the next morning, November 6th, from 8 to 10 in the morning Eastern time, we'll be continuing that broadcast. And who knows how long it will go on. We do it every day for an hour, but how long it will take and who will accept the results.
I'll tell you what, Amy, we've got more than 60,000 people on our list from the Peace and Justice Project and lots more. What we'll do is circulate how to log on to yours and follow yours. And if you could follow our book, we're doing a tour with this book. Fantastic discussions. It is about the arms industry. It is a tract against the times, and we're doing 2 or 3 events a week now all over the country, getting big audiences and a fantastic discussion. You know what? Those discussions are empowering to the people that come who maybe felt a bit cynical and disillusioned by the way the media are treating everything, and they feel a sense of empowerment. So That's really what it's all about. That's why we're all here.
Mm.
Can I say a huge thank you to all three of you for coming on this evening? Moin for staying up so late. Hope you get some rest. You've
Thank
got a
you.
young child to look after, Amy, by the look of things. And Nina, grand to see you. I love that backdrop you've got. Where is it?
Cleveland, Ohio, which you have to come.
I've
See
been
you,
to Cleveland,
Jada.
Ohio. I went there once.
I know you got to
Oh,
come
another
back.
one.
To that foundation, that attempt to found an American Labour Party in the 1990s. Do you remember? I was there at
Yes.
that conference. Okay, if you really want me to come back to the USA, I'll come.
Okay, looking forward to it. We'll work it out with our teams.
Okay, take care, guys. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Bye, Fiddles.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.
Thank you.
Say bye.